Okay, welcome everyone to Disasters Deconstructed Live. I am here with Ksenia. Hey, Ksenia.
Yay! Hi, hello. So exciting.
It is exciting. So we are here with you today, live streaming on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and maybe elsewhere.
Who knows, right?
Who knows? Sorry, I'm getting some feedback because I've got like the stream playing on a different window. So we're here to do the second of our book group episodes, but we're doing it live this time with video, so it's very exciting. And yeah, we're here with some special guests, and we're gonna go for about an hour today on the live stream, and we're gonna release it as a special episode later on.
Well, I'm not sure if many of you know, but we've done this book group thing for a while now, time-wise, not book-wise, unfortunately. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Jason.
I know.
Jason rolled his eyes nicely there. So the first book was The Years of Rice and Salt. And for those who know me, I guess you're not surprised that I chose fiction. And then we read it and discussed it with our guests. And some of you may have heard the special episode. And it was really exciting. And we kind of wanted to continue with this book group idea. And I hope we will continue because it's just kind of fun to read something together and talk about it. We don't really get to do this very often, I suppose. And so Jason got to choose the second book. It's Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and we're going to talk about this book a lot today, well, for the next hour. And, you know, before, I really want to know why Jason chose his book, but I just want to share a few thoughts, I guess, before I'll ask you that. You know, for me, I mean, I don't know anything about the US, right, apart from what I see on Twitter, and I see a lot on Twitter, so thank you, comrades, you know, for keeping my Twitter the way I want to see it. But yeah, so, you know, I've never lived in the US. I've kind of only been there once. So for me, whilst as an outsider, I knew, like, I've heard about prison situation in the US, right? I heard that kind of it's bad, right? I heard that there is a lot of discrimination, but I've never really learned anything about it in detail, right? Just because it just never kind of crossed my path. And so for me, it was absolutely fascinating to, first of all, talk with Carlee Purdum, and she's with us, so you'll hear from her later today. And I guess that was the first time when I actually started thinking about the prison system and kind of the injustice in the US. And then, of course, when I read this book, thank you, Jason, so much. I have really learned so much. It made me really angry. Like, it made me really frustrated many times. You know, I kind of kept reading the book and just asking, but why? But this doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why are we still talking about this in 21st century? So yeah, there was kind of there was a lot of emotion as I was reading that, and I suppose the most shocking thing for me from the whole book was that it really made me realize. It confirmed, I guess, my realization that the system authorizes police violence, right? And that the enemy, as portrayed kind of by the enemy, is kind of chosen by the system, right? And reinforced by the system. And we will talk about it later on. So yeah, thanks again for choosing this. But why have you chose this book? Tell me.
Yeah, it's really great to hear your thoughts on this, Ksenia. And I'm glad it was a great read for you, as it was for me. And so I wanted to read this book because I've been meaning to for quite a while. As someone born in the United States, but who's lived most of my life outside of the United States, I've always kind of felt detached from what's going on here until I moved back. Or actually, until I kind of knew that I was intending to move back a couple of years ago. And so at that point, I really hit the books in a lot of ways to learn more about the context, which I had kind of missed out on in some ways by living in Ireland and Australia for most of my life. And this is just such a significant book. I chose it because I mean, a lot of people say it's one of the most important books of this century.
Right.
And in the last 10 years, it's really been influential, in terms of being used to shape the public discourse, but also, in policy and legislation and so on. So to me, it was an important read for me personally, and I wanted to maybe push the podcast in that way as well, by selecting it. And I think that it's been a long time. I'm so sorry it took so long for me to read it. That's kind of why we selected it. I don't know, when did we select? Like 6 months ago or more?
Probably more. I mean, yeah, I'm going to count the number of nagging messages I sent you.
Well, you know that I have a problem with like having too many books started. And
I do know.
if anybody looks at my Goodreads list, there's just so many in progress. But yeah, it's an amazing read, and it just like you were saying, Ksenia, in our kind of academic circles, there is a lot of people feel that we're like in a post-racial kind of age, right? And especially among liberals, and so it's. I think 2020 has brought a lot of people back to earth, with a bump, which is healthy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we never were in that space. And this book really articulates like how the system is set up to produce discriminatory outcomes.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I chose it. I'm so excited for the guests that we are being joined by today, and to hear their thoughts and insights, especially because many of them are much closer to the issues in this book than I am or you are. So let's bring in our guests and start the discussion. And for everyone who's joining the live stream, you can post any questions that you have just into the chat box on whatever platform you are joining us on, and we will be able to bring them onto the screen and pose them to our guests. If they're for anyone in particular, please type that into your question. Otherwise, we may choose who to ask it to or ask everybody. But this is just a discussion. It's going to be flexible and open, and we're so excited. Okay, so I'm going to bring everybody on screen, maybe one by one, and say hello. Yeah? Okay, so first of all, we have our friend from the book group, Claudia.
Hey,
welcome.
Claudia.
Hi.
Hey, so glad you could join us again. Our faithful book group member, Claudia, is from the University of Lisbon. Thanks for joining us this morning, or afternoon, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Also, another person that you'll recognize from the podcast, Carlee Purdum. Welcome.
Hey,
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Carlee's at Texas A&M.
Mm-hmm.
And Darien is also with us. Darien Alexander Williams from MIT.
Hey.
Greetings, comrades and friends.
Hello.
Morning for you too. And then we have two special guests from the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. I'm going to bring on Sloan. Welcome, Sloan. How are you?
I am good. Thanks for having me.
Good. Sloan Rucker and Richard Thomas.
Hey, what's up, everybody?
Hey, Richard. How are you?
Hi.
Very good.
So glad you all could join us. Yeah.
Thank you. It's great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great. All right. Well, I guess we're here to discuss the book. So let's do that, right? Without any further ado. So what I'm really kind of curious about, right? And I was saying to Jason just before this that I don't really know much about the US context at all. I really want to hear what it is you felt about the book. And, so tell us what was in this book for you. What was the kind of one key, most salient point that you took away? And if you want to share those with us. Shall I just call in a way that I see you on my screen? Is that all right? Yeah. All right, Sloan, please, you go first.
Well, I read this book like before I really started my work. This is kind of the piece that took me from being a reformist to an abolitionist, actually. I'm sorry, my cat may try to make some appearances.
Hey, cat.
She's very clingy.
We love keyboard cats.
But yeah, it's really hard for me to answer just like one major takeaway. But I think just like realizing how systemic like these practices were, like stop and frisk and things that I had never really like knew were going on a day-to-day basis. I think that's really what pushed me to be like, okay, we cannot reform the system because there's too much inherent bias in it. There's no way to stop these things with reforms. So I think my biggest takeaway was just radicalizing into a person who's just like, no, police and prisons are not the answer in any capacity. They are so corrupt that they are not to be fixed. So that was my major takeaway.
Thanks. Thank you so much for sharing this. Richard, do you want to go next?
Sure. Kind of like Sloan, my first encounter with the book was like when I was an undergraduate student before I became radicalized. And I'll give y'all a funny tidbit about the book. No joke, this is 100% real. The thing that got me the most, because I think I've always considered myself informed about the stuff that's happening around me because I've always been a critical thinker. But when I first read The New Jim Crow, the thing that kind of had me shook, there's literally an incident that Michelle Alexander describes about a person that happens to a guy named Richard Thomas. And it's about a disproportionate sentence between how an African-American was treated for the exact same drug crime that a white person was sentenced to. And that kind of got into, wait, it's stuff that if you grew up in the hood in places where I grew up from, it's stuff you kind of already know exists. But for me, when I first read the book, I didn't learn anything new. I just learned, wait, there's a person who's done research on this. There's a scholar, or there's somebody that's respected by academic communities who's pointing stuff out that people already know, but it's good because now it gets more traction. And just the last thing I will say just about the book's kind of importance is that it's a starting point and not an end point for the discussions about what the racialized caste system means in the United States. And with that said, it came out at a time when Obama was president, and there's just this really big idea that we're in a post-racial society, and that had grown, and it's still I think George Floyd and some stuff like that recently have kind of woken it. I would say the majority of the people who want to be woken up about that out, but at that time in 2009, 2010-ish, there was a lot of people who had this phony idea that we were in a post-racial America because America could elect a black president. But people who are on the ground and people who live their daily lives of oppression, they're nah. And this book just kind of highlighted some of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Claudia, do you want to tell us what you thought about this?
Sure. So for me, it made me think much deeper about the pervasive effects of racism on people. So it's much more than a matter of words and feelings that we frequently see being expressed sometimes over the internet. So it's that racism is also about institutions and policies, often from our self-proclaimed democracies that have been responsible for the construction and existence of races. And one of the things that Michelle says for the reason that this still prevails is because of the racial indifference and not really about racial hostility. I think that perhaps this is one of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to break right now, is that racial indifference by highlighting stories from all over the world, narratives, voices, and experiences that people that have been oppressed all around since colonialism, at least. And perhaps the story from the book that shocked me the most is, I can't remember his name, but it's someone who went to jail because of smoking marijuana and then was deprived from voting and from being part of a jury in a court of law. Portugal has abolished you cannot go to jail for drug consumption in Portugal since 2001. And this is one of the things that actually reduced drug consumption in Portugal. It is an example in the world, because we really did diminish the numbers of people going to prison. But so the good set example for other countries. But yeah, I'm also like Ksenia, I'm very distant from the US reality, and the book really helped me get closer to that, and really understanding how institutions and policies can deprive individuals from their agency and freedom, and place them in a forever state of marginalization.
Drugs being the enemy, that sort of shocked me quite a bit, I guess, living in Europe. Carlee, please.
Well, I would say for me, I first read the book probably my first year in graduate school, and one of the comments you said, Ksenia, just when we first started about not knowing very much about U.S. politics or history, that's how I felt when I read this book for the first time. I thought, I don't really know my own history, and it was so different from what I had been taught and how these events had been framed in my own education. And so even just, starting from the beginning, starting from slavery and moving to the Jim Crow, I don't think those are supposed to be the most surprising parts of the book. But for me, I mean, the education system I was brought up in was the history of Black people in America. It stopped with, okay, slavery is over and things were great. And that's where you see so much resentment in white people today, is where education is framed to where things are fine, things are good, and Black people are just stirring up, kind of gaslighting them, making them say they're making issues out of nothing. And to see the history reframed to me was, I realized I do not know my own history, and I have to dig deeper and I have to educate myself, because and it made me realize how education and history is a political power and the impacts that it has, because I was one of those people that I did not know, and I needed to deconstruct how I understood my own history, how I understood my own understanding of the systems around me, and that for me, it started with looking back and starting from the beginning. It was so important. I think that those books do go back and start from slavery and Jim Crow and showing this long history, because you just would not think that people in America would not know their own histories, but it's very political about what has been, the way things have been framed. I mean, I dug up this this was one of the books I read growing up about the Civil War, and just flipping through it was talking about just longing after the Southern culture. And that was really what, states' rights. It was the war for states' rights, and just seeing the differences in education to me was kind of reckoning with my own upbringing, my own education, and what am I going to do differently, with my child, or with what am I going to do to continue to kind of deconstruct my own understanding of these systems.
Darien, please.
Something that I'm really grateful that Michelle Alexander very clearly and lucidly made the point was that or started to make the point that the U.S. government and its many institutions don't have racism in them, like they are racism. And I think she, especially in the first kind of like third of the book, very beautifully writes about how after leftist populists sort of let the Black freedom struggle go because it wasn't in their interest, how during the civil rights struggle, there were Black people who were resisting the racial caste system that Richard just talked about and the economic conditions that they were forced into. And they were already criminalized. And then once they started developing a critique of their conditions, that was criminalized as well. And so we saw, you know, the term law and order start come into American politics. We saw, you know, the terms like mob rule, violence in the streets, the dangerous city. And I'm really grateful for her articulation of that because it's very obvious how that's applicable today, right? Where people are resisting and Black people are resisting the conditions that we are in right now. And part of that condition is just being criminalized regardless, right? Criminalized for sleeping at home, criminalized for working at your job, criminalized for living. And once very coherent critiques of that have come up, calls for defunding the police, calls for abolishing the police, land back, indigenous solidarity movements. Once those have come up, the entire system has reoriented so many resources towards criminalizing that as well. And so we see how, and I think she says it this way, that like, I mean, even if you're super optimistic about the idea that crime prevention can happen, the U.S. government, and I'm not, the U.S. government is actively invested in producing crime, and has always been that way and continues to be that way. As recently as my home state of Florida, and where you're living right now, where the governor is pushing a bill combating violence, disorder, and looting and Law Enforcement Protection Act, that kind of like recriminalizes the things that were like kind of already criminalized. So disorder, you know, sort of felonies for disorderly assemblies and violence and being disorderly is very nebulously defined to enable the state to target whoever they want. Felonies for blocking roadways, we've seen that elsewhere. When I lived in North Carolina, there were talks about it being considered economic terrorism. So a crime against the state to critique what's going on. There's things about monuments in this bill. And on top of that, mandatory minimum jail sentences for this, and specific lines that say like no defunding the police or abolishing the police oriented protests will be permitted in the state of Florida. And so that automatically, so if you have a critique and you wish to express that critique in public, you are criminalized in a felony way. And then, you know, a bunch of things on top of that, like for these charges that there's like no bond or like bail possible for you. And so I think Michelle Alexander wrote about that really beautifully for the civil rights struggle of the 50s and 60s. It's cliche to say like, look, it's happening today, but like it really is happening today with surgical precision. And so I'm really glad that she made the point that the state is not even interested in law, even if you believe in or invested in law and order as a concept, which I don't think many of us are here in this, but I don't want to make assumptions, that the state itself is not invested in order. And we'll continue to find ways to creatively create crime to other ends, which, I would say white supremacy and settler colonialism.
Yeah. Thank you, Darien. And things that are happening today are kind of, and then some, right, compared to the 60s and 70s in some ways. And what you've described now kind of reminds me of Russia at all. Funny that. But, we're not going to go there. Not in this episode anyway. Right. Thank you so much for sharing the insights into the book. I really appreciate it. I'm just enjoying listening to so much, all.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up Darien on the Florida context. And I saw yesterday that there was a significant win for just locally here in Gainesville. The Coalition to Abolish Prison Slavery, UF, had pressured one of the main institutes here to cut ties with prison labor. So. And so that was CAPS and Dream Defenders, Florida Prisoner Solidarity, and others. So that was a pretty significant win yesterday. But I know there's other units at UF that are still participating in this practice. So a lot of work to do, but that was great to see. So I wanted to come to Sloan and Richard and just ask you to maybe tell us a bit about the organization that you're involved with, Fight Toxic Prisons. So first of all, maybe you could, either of you, tell us more about that organization.
Sure, why not? So Fight Toxic Prisons, we're a specifically abolitionist organization, and we organize around the intersection of environmental liberation, queer PTLC organizing, specifically with prison abolition, but abolition is a pretty robust concept. Also, Jason, pretty cool that you're in Gainesville. My best friend lives in Gainesville, and they do stuff with Florida Prisoner Solidarity and lots of other organizations. So it's I know there's a lot of stuff going down in that area.
Oh yeah.
And I know a bunch of the folks from the Dream Defenders too. So it's that's cool. That's what's up.
That's very cool.
On the Fight Toxic Prisons front, one of the biggest things that we do is trying to create solidarity between incarcerated folks and folks on the outside among the issues of environmental harm and prison abolition. Because oftentimes most of the groups that work with directly incarcerated folks, they focus it's centered on the organization or the individuals. We specifically make our work centered on those who are incarcerated. We're not the voices of those who are incarcerated. They're the voices. So with our work, we try our best to help them to amplify their own messages. And then we try to build grassroots movements and coalition building as a method to kind of create that inside-outside solidarity so that we can transform the system. And for me, when we're working on the transformation of systems, it's got to come through multiple avenues. So it's not particularly go vote or anything like that. It's getting on-ground movements together. It's working with those who are most passionate about this issue, specifically prison abolition. And we've developed several different teams. Sloan's a part of our disaster response team. So Sloan, do you want to speak a little bit about our disaster response work that we've been doing?
Yeah, sure. So as y'all may or may not know, basically August and September is hurricane season here, pretty much on the Gulf. So I'm personally, I'm in Houston, Texas. So pretty much all this month has been tropical storms and hurricanes for me. And basically what we have been doing is just identifying which prisons are in the path of the hurricane or tropical storm or whatever's coming up. Recently there was Hurricane Laura that we did a lot of work around. That was going to be impacted Louisiana and Mississippi mostly, as well as other places. But we were really looking at Louisiana, all the units that were going to be right in the eye of the hurricane. So a lot of what we do is create phone zaps, try to disseminate those on our social media, try to get people to call into the units and, demand evacuation. Because a lot of times sometimes prisons do evacuate, and then sometimes they just don't, if there's just too many people in the unit, or if they just don't see it as a threat. A lot of times, really what it is they just do not care about the effects it's going to have on incarcerated people. Often what happens, as in the case with Hurricane Harvey, is people are left like stranded in there, water's rising, inadequate food and water, and ventilation, just really horrible effects. So we try to make that not happen as best as we can. So, having people call in, demanding things from the governors of these states, from the higher ups, just kind of trying to create a culture of like looking out for like incarcerated people who cannot physically flee a hurricane. There will be an evacuation order and like for everybody to leave, but those incarcerated people are still there. So we're really just trying to like basically just bring in a dialogue and a public awareness of like we need to like look out for our incarcerated peers like while they're experiencing natural disasters, because they're experiencing the brunt of it.
Yeah. And I'll say like the other thing to like what's been complicated in terms of like our disaster response stuff is that we're also working on like COVID stuff too, because prison evacuation typically like I think this will come as a surprise to no one, that the dehumanizing experiences of prisons and like what prisons do to people and it does to like an entire system, a culture, everybody involved in that. Like incarcerated folks, they're treated as non-human entities. So like, and as it relates to disasters, like most prisons, and we'll say probably all, aren't going to do the things that are necessary to provide for their welfare, like getting them adequate water, shelter, safety, all those different things. So there's a plethora of things that aren't provided for incarcerated folks. But like the other part of that is how to think what are potential responses also in the midst of a global pandemic. And typically like we get a lot of inside information on what incarcerated folks are going through in terms of like typically the response to like a global pandemic or even to like some of the hurricane stuff is just put them on lockdown. That's literally the solution to everything related to like what's going on with incarcerated folks. And like I was saying a second ago, because of the nature of the prison system as an entity, so regardless of how nice or how good you can have a prison, if that's even a possibility, the dehumanizing nature of any prison system creates this where like a marginalized group, because like if you do the research, most of the folks who are incarcerated come from marginalized categories because that's the way the system was created. They become even more marginalized because this system predicated on like their dehumanization further capitalize on that for economic gain. So like the combination of those things are some of the things that we're working towards. So, and when we're doing like the COVID related stuff, it's complicated because where are folks going to be able to evacuate to? And oftentimes it might be another facility, which also suffers other issues like overcrowding and potential outbreaks already at that facility. So there's the work on that front is very challenging just in terms of understanding like what is it that we as people on the outside can do. And kind of what we've been trying to do more of is just make sure that we have strong connections with those most impacted. So that's kind of supposed to be our guiding point for everything. So if like incarcerated folks have specific demands that they want from us, we take that and then we kind of try and amplify those. And we're often in communication with jailhouse lawyers, which is a group of currently incarcerated folks who are advocating for their own rights and for themselves. So we try to be in coordination with folks like that and even family members. Sloan's been part of a lot of discussions with family members and other folks who have a loved one who's incarcerated that we then try to like amplify what's the need of those people. So that's kind of like the scope of what guides our organizing in terms of what we do. But like I said, like each situation can get complicated just because of like all the different multi-dimensional aspects of that.
Thanks for really breaking that down for us, Richard and Sloan, and explaining how you're working at that kind of intersection of environmental justice and mass incarceration and organizing different efforts. And I love how you guys came together with Darien and Carlee and others who are more in the academic space over the summer, and I think we were all quite taken with the work that you all did for the Natural Hazards workshop, and you had a poster that was titled "No Justice, No Resilience: Abolition of Police and Prisons as Hazard Mitigation," and I think it really caught the attention. How did that happen? Why did you guys start working together?
I guess I can kind of speak to that. With all of the protests, the uprisings going on with after the murder of George Floyd, there are so many people in the hazards and disaster space that were talking about it and talking about the injustice of it, but maybe not connecting it to their own work, or maybe not connecting it to the spaces that we occupy. And it honestly got started over an Instagram conversation. We all kind of follow each other on social media. The people on the poster, Viola Jacobs, Benika Dixon, Darien, are all brilliant academics in those spaces. So, I was aware of their work and their role through the connection to the Bill Anderson Fund at the Natural Hazards workshop, and Viola being a Texas A&M alumni. And I reached out to Viola. We started talking and thought there's a group of people that are really seeing the connections here and seeing the importance, and let's bring this into our field. Let's bring this discussion home. And where to us in the summer, that's the Natural Hazards workshop, where so many people come together and convene from across disciplines, but in the context of hazards and disasters, and say, let's find a way to make to make us own that this is our responsibility too, that we have a role in this, that we have a connection, and that we have something to say about policing in prisons, and we have something to contribute to that discussion, and then hopefully bring others from our field into it.
It's fascinating. I love that you guys collaborate, and the story is just so great, and yeah, just like Jason, absolutely loved your poster. And for those of you guys who are watching this now, check out the YouTube video where all of you are explaining the poster so well, and we have it on our Twitter feed.
And I'd also say that Sloan and Richard came to us through the organization, the Texas Prison Air Conditioning Advocates. They partner with the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons, and like Richard said in the beginning, talking about Michelle Alexander being in it, like, people on the ground know this is happening. Activists and organizers know that this is happening, the intimate details of it, the harm, the reality, and academics. It was great for us to partner with them because they really pushed us to grow and not be kind of meek or timid about the blaring connections that we saw. So we're very thankful to have partnered with activists and organizers in this space. And Richard and Sloan were fantastic to work with and are brilliant people. And it was just a brilliant collaboration of all the right people in the same space, kind of pushing a really needed conversation forward.
It's great, and it definitely showed. So thank you guys for all doing this. I want to ask Darien and Claudia. So you guys both work in disaster space, right? Well, that's how we kind of met through the disaster space. And to me, what was I guess really clear in the book is that everything that's happening now is a result of a historical process, right? Very often kind of temporarily removed. So why as disaster scholars should we kind of deeply care about racism historically or today, and why should we also care about abolition of first slavery and now prisons and police? How does this all relate to disasters?
Should I go first?
Go, and then Darien. Perfect.
Yeah, so historical and present forms of racism, leave people in a much vulnerable position, and that's what we've seen in the book. They might already have been in vulnerable positions, but the racism they have to face deteriorate their conditions. And I think that disasters are frankly better understood when we look at its construction throughout time. And this is the reason that for me, we should be looking at these questions from an historical perspective. My field of research is actually migration mostly. So I investigate a lot about migrants and non-migrants' motivations to move. And it is impossible to disassociate their motivations and what happens in their lives from their historical background, where they come from and what happened there. And if a disaster strikes and that affects them, all of this needs to be taken into account and just not assume that something happened just because of a natural hazard, for example.
Thanks, Claudia. Darien, do you want to?
Sure. And I should preface that I think about this in terms of, yes, being a disaster scholar, but just being a person who's out here doing work, experiencing things. And I think, so if you are to read a book like The New Jim Crow, and you believe the information being presented is true, and you understand that in the United States, there's a whole system, a regime of laws and institutions that are unjust and that are layered with injustice down to the root, then I don't think it is possible to do the work and sort of neatly build like a little career for yourself, or like neatly kind of fit within the bounds of a discipline or a profession or a job or a 9-to-5. So some of my scholarship touches this, and I think it's really important. I also think for me, I'm just speaking for myself, I also think it's really important for me to be in the streets. I can be in the streets demonstrating in solidarity with other groups. I think if you understand that the laws are white supremacist in nature and your entire life still fits neatly within those laws, and maybe you should question your entire life. And so, Richard mentioned earlier sort of transforming a system through diverse means. And I think it's easy for some of us to encounter that idea and think like, okay, I'm doing a little piece of something rather than what are the diverse ways that I can engage this in my life? And some of it's like, it involves being messy. It doesn't even necessarily require adding things to your life all the time. Sometimes it's removing things, right? Sometimes it means not collaborating with certain people because you're principled. Sometimes it means not going after certain grants because they're from questionable sources. Sometimes it means turning down something that is an opportunity to you in order to pursue other work that is also an opportunity to you and an opportunity to so many other people. Sometimes it means breaking relationships. In our field, we have a large Facebook group, Emergency Management Issues, that's like almost 8,000 people. And sometimes there's really cool things posted in there. And then sometimes there's like blatantly white nationalist things posted in there. And like not even subtly racist, like people at the helm of state power who are able to direct resources, particularly during disaster, who are saying something that is white nationalist And many times conversations get shut down in that Facebook group. This is just one example, right? And sure, the conversation gets shut down, but those people are still there. They still have their jobs. They still show up to our conferences. And so, so I think it's messy. And so I think it's also important for me to feel like a whole person in all of the spaces that I'm part of, including, going back to the original question, including like scholarship, like feeling like, okay, I'm writing about something that means something to me and that means something to the people I care about, rather than sort of like a compartmentalized, publication, like line on my CV.
Thank you, Darien. I think what you said totally resonates with me. It's about being a whole person, and solidarity is always messy. I don't think it is ever easy. But I guess some people don't want to agree with that, right? But yeah, thank you so much for this.
I want to come back to Sloan and Richard to talk about how we organize. And there's a question that came in from Jennifer Lawrence as well on YouTube. But I wanted to ask you, like, how do you frame organizing against these new kind of iterations of racial injustice and oppression? Maybe contrasting to earlier organizing efforts against slavery and Jim Crow. Like, how do you see organizing today? And Jennifer Lawrence on YouTube asks about how folks can get involved in the kind of work you're doing. So maybe you can address those together.
I feel like, my historical knowledge is not that great. I'm not a history major, but when I hear about the abolitionist struggle, it seems like it was a lot of fairly different people who might have had different reasons for being abolitionists, but they still work together. And I kind of see that today too. Like, when you organize in groups, everybody may think prisons are wrong, but you might be working with a Marxist when you're an anarchist, or you might be working with somebody who's a dim soc. And like, I feel like people have different perspectives. And at the end of the day, I think like a big part of organizing is being able to, like Darien said, knowing who not to work with, knowing like which principles are not in line with yours, but knowing which principles are in line with yours, and really just finding people that have similar goals as you. I feel like when I first started organizing, I feel like I was really like lone wolf mentality. Like I would write to prisoners and I kind of try to address things on my own. But then I was like, I cannot do this by myself. I really need like a lot of other people to help me, because I make a lot of mistakes and I have a very limited skill set. So I think coming together with people who might have slightly different political opinions, but still have the same values, core values, people who have different skill sets, I think that's really the key to organizing. As cliche as that sounds, just coming together with other people. But it is more strategic than that, and it is more intentional than that, but definitely like not trying to do like everything yourself, or like having this weird complex that like every issue is yours to fix. Like when you are just in a community of people who want the same results as you, it's a lot easier and it's a lot more efficient.
Thanks, Sloan.
Yeah. To Sloan's point, like it sounds really generic and basic, but like they have a really like that's probably to me the biggest key is to know that we can't do this alone, and we've got to build together as a collective. And like I said two things earlier that I'll kind of like explain a little bit more about, because I'll apologize to everybody. I have a really bad habit of like saying things sometimes that's very specific, and not knowing that people can't read my mind. Like my friends get on me all the time for doing that. So like diversity of tactics is like an organizing strategy that I recommend for folks who want to get involved in the movement. So what do I mean by that? When I say that, I'll point out two key things for that in terms of abolition. First, it's understanding a robust definition of what abolition is. So when I talk about being an abolitionist, I'm not simply talking about abolishing the prison system or abolishing policing. Those are two parts of abolition. But for me, a robust understanding of abolition means that we're working together as a collective to transform an entire system that rules in our society that's predicated on oppression and white supremacy. So both prisons and policing are symptomatics of that way that society is structured. Not to mention, like, capitalism is also a part of that, but capitalism is also symptomatic of a society that's structured on white supremacy and white supremacist values. So from like an abolitionist take, my thinking is like diversity of tactics. So folks, if you're really interested in like appealing to politicians to create a legislation to like improve prison conditions, like TPAA, we've worked with TPAA and they've been working on a bill to get air conditioning into all Texas prisons because there's 127 prisons in Texas, only 106 of them currently have air conditioning. Or wait, 106 of them don't have air conditioning. Yeah. So if that's something that you're interested in, there's some ways to get involved in some stuff like that. Like there's the legislative route. There's also a legal route in terms of if you're wanting to get involved in a lawsuit, supporting people who are building a lawsuit, doing some of the research and stuff like that. And like me, I'm a teacher and an educator. So part of my abolitionist struggle is like, I'm in school right now. Technically, I'm supposed to be teaching some kids, but I'll get into that in like 10 minutes or so. But like, it's it's working towards like creating a liberatory sense of education and teaching kids in a way that doesn't reinforce white supremacist values. So like each of us can work in something that we're passionate about towards this broader goal of abolition. And like, for sure, if you're more interested in the abolitionist ideas and more in like prison abolition stuff, Fight Toxic Prison, and there's lots of other organizations that are doing very specific work around prison abolition. So like, for sure, if people want to get involved in that, absolutely. So that's kind of like my spiel on like what it is that we're doing in terms of organizing. And the last thing I'll address pretty quickly is like the new Jim Crow, its relationship to the Karen Jim Crow. Like back when the book came out, this is totally my phrasing. There are some serious major haters of the new Jim Crow. Like there's some Black intellectuals and other folks who said that Michelle Alexander was like, her take on the new Jim Crow was like exaggerating from like what Jim Crow actually was, because policy in the prison system and the practices that are enacted today, they're in no way mirrored the Jim Crow lynchings of the South that reigned supreme from literally 1865. So I would technically say from 1865 till today, but the way they framed it from basically 1865 to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So that's what they were saying. But for me, like my personal take is that it didn't go deep enough. But in terms of connecting it from the struggle from the past to today, she's very on point. And the point in terms of framing the argument, less about how like it's a particular practice of lynching, even though there are modern day lynchings. Like that stuff still happens fairly frequently, and it doesn't get nearly as much media coverage. And it happens in a myriad of ways, from a police shooting to a literal person being lynched in Houston, Texas, and in other places too. But my point with that is the same mechanisms that made Jim Crow possible, and it's the same mechanisms that made slavery possible. Because you can do from a historical perspective, you can trace abolition history from the beginning of slavery, because there's Black folks and indigenous folks who were abolitionists back in the beginning of slavery, because it is abolition is about like the instant, because slavery was never about like the labor. It was about the capitalist enterprise predicated on the labor of folks. So we can take the transition of like abolition in the past to looking how that same system continues to be reinforced. And that gets to the point I was going to make about the title. Jim Crow is just the next iteration of that. So as folks begin to organize and think about what is abolition today, the abolitionist struggle that we're fighting today, our ancestors were fighting for that same abolitionist struggle 200-300 years ago, because it's really just because the system and the structure predicated on white supremacy that existed in 17 and 1800s is that same system and structure that's predicated on white supremacy today. The form is slightly changed. Like prisons is a form of new slavery, and Sloan's been involved with groups in prison slavery, and we've all been a part of organizations that specifically work to make that very clear connection between prison slavery and like and slavery from the 1800s. So that's a very real connection, but it's also very true that the institutions and the cultural values and the structures that created those things to begin with are very much present today. So like the abolitionist, so I would say like framing it as the abolitionist struggle today is the same as it was from the past. It's just slavery by another name. And like another podcast, another day, I can give you a list of people who've written about this and folks who talking about that issue specifically.
And we would love that. So, please do, Richard, and we'll share it far and wide. We're mindful of time. We know that, you guys are all busy, and we thank you so much for the time you've given us today. I could have sat with you here all day. I wish I could. And I hope I will one day, just meet with you and just chat. For those of you in the audience, if you haven't read the book, please go and read the book. If you're in the UK, I can give you the copy, lend you the copy. So, but please go read this book. You will really learn a lot, I'm sure. So yeah, we just want to thank you once again. So today with us, we had Richard Thomas. Thank you so much, Richard. Sloan Rucker. Thank you, Sloan. Claudia Santos. Thank you again, Claudia. Carlee Purdum. Thank you, Carlee. And Darien Alexander Williams. Thank you so much, Darien. And thank you all again for your time.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being with us. I know you got to go teach some kids, Richard. I'm so glad that you're teaching our kids, man. So glad. So yeah, everybody who's watching, don't forget to follow our podcast. Check us out on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, please. We're going to be doing some more live streams. We've got one coming up. We'll announce soon in a few weeks. And yeah, we're just really glad you're here with us. If you didn't catch this live, I hope you enjoyed the recording. I'm sure everybody would like to hear your questions. We didn't really have time to get to too much questions, but I'm sure people will have questions after watching this. So please get in touch. Yeah, thanks all.